Hello, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the session titled Bridging Silos in Global Digital Cooperation. Thank you for being with us today, despite the early time of the day and the last day of the IGF. And yeah, thanks to the speakers to be here. I hope that the early morning session didn't prevent you to sing last night at the music night. And yes, I'm Andrea Calderaro. I'm the director of the EU Cyber Direct Initiative, which is a EU program funded by the European Commission to support various forms of international cooperation efforts. It's a program that has been established in 2018, and mostly in the context of the about to be launched, the UN Open-Ended Working Group, in the context of the UN General Assembly First Committee, to support negotiations around the state responsible behavior for ensuring safety and security of the cyber domain. And the Cyber Direct, I like to think the Cyber Direct played kind of a critical role in shaping what cyber diplomacy, what we refer today as cyber diplomacy. But the story is that, of course, negotiation, international cooperation in the cyber and the digital domain have not started in 2018. It's something that, of course, we all well know that started way before that. Some might refer also the negotiations around the establishment of ICANN as an early form of international cooperation, discussion around how to make the DNS, the technical layer of the internet, functioning in the best ways possible. And after that, we did have the launch of the World Summit on Information Society in 2003 and 2005, where it was a platform created exactly to negotiate form of governance of the internet, which was supposed to be the best model of governance in the context of the internet, exactly beyond the negotiations referring specifically on the technical layer of the internet. Then we had a boost of in other proliferation of other international cooperation efforts. We did have the launch of the Freedom of Online Coalition that was launched exactly right after the Arab Spring, bringing together Minister of Foreign Affairs, discussing what human rights are supposed to mean in the context of the internet. And here we are, more and more to get to these days, where the impression is that we do have now a healthy international cooperation effort, because we have plenty of options to platform tools to negotiate various aspects of the internet. But there might be a problem. The problem is that the impression is that the proliferation of this event has also the risk, that's an open question we have here for today, jeopardize effort, created, of course, an inclusive environment, but the risk is that they created silos of competences, silos of perspectives on what international cooperation in the cyber domain really entails. And yeah. And actually, right in these days, we are discussing, I mean, we have two groups of people here, communities. One is excited or concerned because of the negotiations that will happen in New York in a couple of weeks around, again, the UN Open-Ended Working Group, the final substantive discussion, negotiation. And another topical moment, which is the negotiations happening in Geneva about the VUCIS +20, discussing whether there will be even another IGF. And already the fact that there are these two topical moments happening pretty much at the same time, it showcases how communities very much, negotiations happen in parallel, and community risk to disperse their energy and instead then bridging their competences to ensure a holistic and more effective way to approach the functioning of the internet from a governance and a technical perspective. So that is the reason why we are here today. So in the next 1 hour, we are supposed to understand whether or not and how eventually we need to bridge silos in global digital cooperation. I'm going to have this discussion, kick off this discussion with a standing line of speakers here. We do have Madeleine Carus, Professor of Global Politics and Cybersecurity from University College of London. Ellen Hickok, the Managing Director of Global Network Initiative, Veronica Ferrari, a Global Policy Advocacy Coordinator at the Association for Progressive Communication, and Constantino Komayadis, a Resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. So, this is a Q&A session format. This means that I will start collecting a first round of reaction around these specific issues that I've been mentioning so far. And then I will have a second round of questions for you. So I would like to start, let's start with Madeleine. What do you think? What's your impression? You've been around, you've been focusing a lot on the implementation of the evolution of international cooperation, specifically in the cybersecurity domain, but you've been also following IGF and other forms of international cooperation for a while. So what do you think? Are we operating in silos? Is that the case? Is it healthy, the international cooperation platform that we have so far? Or, yeah, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. I think it's a really timely topic, and it's a good opportunity for us to revisit this. I was thinking about it over the course of the last few days while I was enjoying this IGF, that really in those early IGFs, in my experience, were quite a bit more focused on technical dimensions, and there was a lot more of the technical community at these meetings. For me, it was a great opportunity to learn more about the technical dimensions of internet governance. And over time, we saw this growing focus and understanding that technology is not simply technical. It is political and economic, and it has social implications and human rights implications, and that happened actually over time at the IGF. But now I feel there's a real lack of technical sessions here, and I think that's representative of the conversation more generally, that there's a kind of, I mean, this space has expanded so much in the last 20 years, and the breadth of what we need to cover and discuss has grown so much that in some ways it's not surprising that there's a kind of splintering of events and communities to an extent. But I guess if I had to say what is the most risky silo that I see, it's that, again, we're not engaging properly with the technical community. And I don't count policy advisors from big tech companies as the technical community. So those people are often on these panels, but that is not the technical community. And I think that's a really important point. I saw there was a lightning talk yesterday on human rights. There was some researchers have done a study, an analysis of, what do we call them? You know, human rights statements, human rights online statements, and they have done a study of them. They found there were 321 of these that have come out of these kind of processes over the last 20 or 30 years. And that in itself, why we have so many of those, is something we need to reflect on ourselves, because why do we keep creating these instead of collaborating? So it's kind of those two things, I think, an overemphasis on some issues where we keep recreating these documents and statements, and an under-engagement with that community that is now, to me, once again, off somewhere else, working quite separately. I think one of the positive things I've seen come out, though, is this, again, there's many of these, but these policy repositories where we see, this kind of collection or collation of policies put together in one place so that actors are not having to start from square one with what's always very, very complex policy development. I'll leave it there, Andrea.
Super, thank you, Madeleine. I already have so many two-fingers questions for you, but I'll keep that for later. So we'll continue to collect, again, reaction to this first comment that I had before. So Costantino, please.
Thanks, Andrea, and good morning, everyone. It was a rough night. So I'm going to look a little bit at collaboration in a different way. for sure, from where I am sitting and the work that I'm doing and what I'm observing, collaboration has changed, especially compared to the early days of either being here at the IGF or the way we were talking and understanding the internet. And in many ways, of course, this is inescapable, right? The world is very different compared to what it was 20 years ago. The technology and the internet itself is very different to what it was 20 years ago, and we have new issues, new challenges that we need to deal with. But I think that one of the things that, for me, it's really striking is that collaboration now feels forced. It feels much more calculated. And the problem with that is that collaboration sits at the heart of what we're all doing. It really sits at the heart of the internet. The internet is a byproduct of collaboration. It is this idea that we keep on beating the drum over the past 20 years, multi-stakeholderism. It's really about collaborative governance. It's about bringing people together from different backgrounds to try to figure out some very complex problems. And the way they managed to do that on the internet was because there was a shared goal. They had a very specific question in front of them, right? Create a communications network that can withstand destruction. That was it. Now, how do you get there? It is your problem. But once you have that shared goal, then, and you all agree that this is where we want to go, you start the compromise. We don't have that shared goal anymore. Especially in the context of states and the way they participate in these conversations in the past few years, we see a very much different approach and a very much different understanding, even to what the internet is. And by that, I mean even what global reach means, or interoperability means, or openness means. So once you start coming from all these different angles and you don't have this common understanding, inevitably you are at a point where collaboration becomes very difficult. And if you add now, of course, the geopolitical landscape, which is constantly changing and it's creating challenges, the fact that governments really now are seeing the internet either as a weapon or as a means to exert some sort of control, then those layers add so much pressure into this idea of collaboration that you end up having it fragmented, that you end up creating duplicating efforts. And we see that, really, we see this in real time within the UN system. We are here discussing the WSIS process and the WSIS review after 20 years. And at the same time that we're discussing the WSIS review, we have the implementation of the Global Digital Compact, which practically touches on the same issues. So, and we keep saying, right, we were telling the UN, do not create duplicative processes. This is not helpful because a lot of communities, especially civil society, and especially civil society from the global majority countries, cannot participate in all those things. So if you really want to talk about collaboration, you need to streamline and you need to simplify. Yet again, we are finding ourselves exactly where we were not supposed to be. So we need to take a step back and we really need to think, what is it that we're trying to do? What is that shared goal that we want to reach? And once we get that, we need to rethink the processes and the paths that will get us there. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Costantino. Adonai.
Okay, so hello, my name is Elena Hickok, and I'm with the Global Network Initiative. And maybe just a quick word about GNI. So we're a multi-stakeholder initiative bringing together companies, civil society, academics, and investors towards responsible business conduct. And to perhaps build on what Konstantinos was saying, when I think about and I reflect on, the current state of digital cooperation at the international level, of course, it faces issues of operating in silos, a lack of capacity, a need for knowledge sharing. But I think these are issues that have already existed. And I think it's important to recognize that we are seeing a number of really concerning trends across different cooperation spaces happening at the international level. And I'll just call out a couple of these. And Konstantinos alluded to some of these. So one, I think we're seeing a breakdown of consensus in spaces where we used to have consensus. And an example of this is the US calling a vote in the CSTD meeting in April on issues around gender, SDGs, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think another concerning trend is we're starting to see compromises in the name of reaching consensus, We saw this around the negotiations in the UN Cybercrime Treaty, where from the perspective of civil society, we saw a number of compromises around due process, human rights, freedom of expression, and privacy. And we were told by governments that these were needed to reach consensus on a text, and they were concerned about actually a lower standard being reached if we didn't make these compromises. I think we're also starting to see a failure of existing cooperation models to be truly responsive and inclusive, and indicative of this is reactions from governments towards more state-centric models of internet governance, moves towards data localization, national control over infrastructure and governance, reflecting very real concerns about countries' abilities to have their own ecosystems for AI, control over their data, et cetera. But I think it does indicate a failure of existing cooperation models. I think we're also starting to see countries play by different rules, establishing parallel norms, bypassing traditional multilateral channels, et cetera. And we have to be aware that these different rules these different tactics are being used in these spaces. And I think we're also, and Konstantinos, you noted this, seeing a proliferation of parallel and often overlapping international digital processes, particularly in the space of artificial intelligence. We have just so many different efforts around AI trying to set principles and standards and norms, and they're not necessarily speaking to each other. And lastly, I think all of this is happening in the context of closing civic space, where civil society is facing a lack of funding, it's facing a lack of capacity to engage in these different processes, but it's also facing a lot of pressure in how it shows up in these spaces. And that's really putting pressure on the ability of these to be inclusive and truly multi-stakeholder. So I'll just stop there as some trends seeing at the international level in cooperation spaces.
Super, thank you, Elena. Veronica,
Yeah.
your comments?
I don't need to do anything, right? It's working already. Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Veronica Ferrari, as Andrea said. Thanks for the invitation and the invitation to APC. Very quickly, APC is an international civil society organization. We are also a network of members that are organizations from civil society and activists, mainly from the Global South. APC has been engaging in many of the processes we've been mentioning. For example, the GDC, WSIS, cyber-related processes, in general bringing human rights, gender, and social justice perspectives. So yeah, just to echo a bit what my colleagues said, we are seeing these siloed processes, for example, in the areas of digital rights, AI, cybersecurity, and also connected with responses to TFGBV, technology-facilitated gender-based violence. So topics that are deeply connected, but too often are treated separately, basically. So in some cases, this leads to fragmentations and actually limited protections to human rights and gender equalities in the cases I'm particularly focusing on. So if we look at, for example, AI governance and TFGBV, we are conducting research now about how normative frameworks are addressing both topics. So what we are seeing in this preliminary research is that many AI frameworks mention issues of non-discrimination, of fairness, but few engage with the gender harms of AI, for example, connected with deepfakes. So it's good to see the recent FOC statement on artificial intelligence addressing TFGBV as one of the risks of this type of technologies. But TFGBV frameworks and norms often are not addressing the emerging risk of AI. And we see a similar disconnection, for example, in cybersecurity related discussions. APC follows the open-ended working group, the process that you mentioned, that is at the first committee at the UN. And we see really few references, for example, to human rights perspectives. And there is a lot of already agreed language in many of the countries that participate in these negotiations. The FOC, for example, has a really good statement on human rights approaches to cybersecurity, but it's still difficult to see that being pushed at the first committee. So civil society, APC, and other organizations, we are trying to bring these human rights and gender perspectives to those spaces. And then I can develop a bit more on that. But yeah, this disconnection, as we see it, leads to duplicated and inconsistent efforts with no shared mandates of these spaces, sometimes even contradictory norms developed across different forums, and we see weakened language in connection with human rights and gender in particular. And El and I already touched on this, but and Constantinos too, but we see also consultation fatigue from civil society. So it's connected with this lack or limited capacity of civil society to engage and follow all these different processes, how difficult is that for us, and mainly coming from the Global South. So we still see the IGF, ABC still sees the IGF as a key space to connect all of these spaces, and spaces and coalitions as the FOC. We are part of the DAY3 network also as a place for that collaboration, and even, as Madeline was saying, with dialogue with other stakeholders, right, with the technical community. And just to finalize about this lack of coordination among different sectors, so civil society tends to address these multiple processes we have to follow and this fatigue. We tend to work in coalitions. I think we can do better in terms of working with the private sector in certain issues, but for example, the civil society worked closely with some companies and GNI in relation to the Cybercrime Convention and trying to bring human rights perspectives there. And APC in general plays a role like connecting different coalitions, right? Also of civil society. So I think we can do better in that sense, but we're already doing that, working in collaborations to address this challenge in terms of following and inputting so many processes. So I'll stop here for now, but yeah, happy to continue the conversation.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, I have two fingers for all of you, really. I mean, the impression is that we actually, that this first round of reaction shows how each of us look at the cake from different angles. So it showcases that actually we are still operating in silos, even if people sitting at this table, they are passionate about experience and passionate about what they're doing. So Madeline, the two fingers for you, you touch a really important point, which is that most of the times the negotiatory community does not have the technical understanding on the issues that they are supposed to negotiate. And we've been talking this for years, really, and the point is that the issue is still very much there. Of course, it has to do because on the fact that the negotiatory body of diplomats, they rotate all the time, so it takes a lot of time for them to catch up with the topic and so on. There is a lack of institutional knowledge about what has happened before. That also is a kind of a weakness. So how are we going to be able to solve that? I mean, of course, the solution is, yeah, we have to bridge silos, how the diplomatic community needs to engage more with the technical community. But that's not the case after so many years. Still, that's not the case. So what's your reflection on that? And again, you've been involved in cybersecurity negotiations, but very much involved also in the IGF community. So did you see a development, or actually things are going even worse?
Well, sadly, I'd have to say I think it's getting worse. And I don't put the blame of this on any particular community, because I think, by and large, the technical community can lack understanding of diplomacy, of policy processes, that makes it very difficult for them to feed in useful advice. And the diplomatic community, for all the reasons you mentioned, can have a lack of understanding of these very rapidly changing technical elements of internet governance or cybersecurity or AI. So it's perhaps not surprising that they struggle to communicate together. But what I think we've observed is that although we understand that these are very much, that these are very much global issues, we again, going back to our comfort zones of our own communities. So the technical community somehow retreats. I think the technical community finds it frustrating that they provide very good advice over and over again and they don't see it followed. And the policy community or the diplomatic community feels, they're getting unusable advice. And the only sort of recommendations that I can sort of offer in this space is that we develop greater respect for both of those communities within them. So I think we could learn a lot from, looking, for example, at how certs and C-certs, these very technical communities work in a very apolitical way. They really are able to go over the top or under or around geopolitics to collaborate in a highly effective way. And I think there's a lot to be learned from how they do that. I think that, but geopolitics is there. It is there, and that's what diplomats understand and how they work. But I also think we could focus more on these practices, these long-established practices of science diplomacy, of allowing academics or technical communities to collaborate across these difficult geopolitical lines, because we have an awful lot to gain by doing that. And then I think as an educator, as an academic, I have to say that universities have a lot to answer for here as well, because by and large, we educating people still in these very narrow silos. So you can do a degree in international relations if you aspire to be a diplomat. You never have to learn anything technical along that educational pathway. Or you can do a computer science degree, and it's shocking how little, I work in a department of computer science, it's shocking how little they are taught about what happens to the technology that they develop. They have very little understanding of the social, political, economic implications of what they do. So I mean, we can work on that at the educational level. But we also have to have a willingness in those communities to go into uncomfortable places where we don't know all the answers, where we will have to ask and ask again and ask again for information that we may not be able to easily absorb. But I think it's absolutely fundamental that we bring those two worlds closer into conversation.
Okay. Super, and very much similar to the question that I had for Madeline. Costantino, you've been involved in lots of negotiations around the technical aspects of the various layers of the internet. I'm referring to the ITF and so on. You've really been at the center of those conversations, and you've not been very much engaged exactly in the classic, more traditional cyber diplomatic platforms. That's exactly where the silos really. And I'm not sure whether you really cared about the cyber diplomatic engagement, and because of course you were focused so much into that. So, but the impression is because of this lack of knowledge in the multilateral platforms, most of the actually really important things happen exactly in the negotiation of technical protocols. And looking at what Madeline was saying about the geopolitics of these things, these might have actually long-term implications, more longer-term implications than actually what happens in the UN context when it comes to classic cyber diplomacy. So you've been very much following all of this. I'm referring, of course, about other parts in China negotiating some protocols compared to exactly. So I think you have a good overview on that and critical approach to what's going on there.
Yes, so it's... So I remember the first time I attended an ITF meeting. That was back in 2012, and I was not welcomed. I can tell you that much. I was a policy person, and everybody was like, what are you doing here? I mean, you are just here to talk about policy stuff that are only going to confuse us, and we are here to create technology. And in many ways, it really goes back to the original comment that I made. These communities, at least in the beginning, they were very much operating. I remember the question that they were always asking was, what is good for the internet? Going back to this idea of a shared goal, right? And it's very easy to answer it when you create technology, frankly. You know, you can all get behind what is good for the internet and work together and try to figure it out outside of politics, outside of ideologies, outside of all those things that tend to complicate things. The thing that, however, they never understood was that effectively what they were also doing was some form of diplomacy, right? I mean, the way, especially if you attend an ITF meeting and you go and you start, you know, and you're having all these conversations that are based on back and forths and thousands of emails in mailing lists, and then you have the BOFs, and then you go there, and through consensus you end up creating a protocol. It is a different form of negotiation. these communities have evolved as well over the years. And I think that they have learned it often the hard way, that they can no longer operate in silos. And there are different levels of that. I mean, the idea, for instance, right now, we see an increasing number of governments participating, and we see actually governments even leaning to that community in order to get some answers. A very famous case was the Finnish government at some point was having a very intense debate domestically about network neutrality, and they literally went to the ITF and they put it in front of them. And they said, listen, this is the question that we have, and from a technical perspective, we don't know what to do, tell us what to do. And the ITF community came together and they had a conversation and they figured it out. ICANN is a very different structure altogether. It has a governmental advisory committee, which literally consists of almost all governments of the world, and it has gone through its own phases of how much should the GAC get involved, what sort of influence it needs to have. Occasionally, it goes through waves of too much, too little, until you find the middle, and that is inevitable. But you need to foster those spaces, no matter how uncomfortable they are, in order to be able and get where you want to get. Because right now, again, we need to face some very harsh realities. And these communities need to face them as well. The fact that everyone now is interested in the internet. And occasionally, one of the things that I have observed, and I was literally having this conversation with Madeline before we started, was governments do not really understand how the internet works. I mean, they pretty much take it for granted. It is this thing that works. So, bar the United States, which inevitably has spent a lot of years fostering the internet through funding in the early days, and then through, of course, a very robust private sector, only China has literally spent a lot of time understanding the internet. And they had to do that because they had to make some really tough choices, meaning they wanted to take what they could take from the current architecture of the internet, the globalness, in order to create companies that are globally competitive and throw them out and scale. But at the same time, they needed to understand the technology in order to be able and restrict it, so the information that was coming into their country was not something that could upset the ideologies of the CPP. So they have and create an elaborate system that is able, right now to filter effectively what they don't want in, but at the same time be able to communicate with the global network when they want to. And in order to do that, you really need to study it. I cannot think of any other country that has actually done that. And this is where we need this interaction of policymakers and the technologists to come together, because really a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine and former colleague who is an engineer, has told me, we're discussing about the internet and the future of the internet, and he said to me, you cannot shoot the internet dead, right? It's not going to take a bullet to kill the internet. The internet will go through, if you want to kill it, it will be killed through 1,000 cuts. And I believe that if you don't understand how it works, those 1,000 cuts are done inadvertently and unintentionally in most of the cases. But you really, whether you want to regulate something and you go into the architecture, whether you weaponize it, whether you do whatever you want, unless you do not spend time understanding how it works, you risk of actually undermining a lot of what you want to preserve ultimately, especially if you're a democratic country.
Super, yes. And it's true that, the IGF served kind of a bit of this role. It's probably the place, the platform where this knowledge building really much happen, where technical community is supposed to engage with the civil society. We know the whole multi-stakeholder approach. And Elona, you're following very much closely the VUCs, the VUCs plus 20. And what is your view on that? Or do you think that the VUCs, the implementation of the VUCs would solve this issue? What's missing there? Or how we can ensure that the multi-stakeholder community very much translate this knowledge building into concrete action that happens elsewhere?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think maybe to start with, I want to pick up on a little bit about what Madeline was saying, because it sounded like you were starting to articulate different components, ingredients that need to come together to make cooperation happen, to build these silos across different stakeholder communities to build the trust, right? And so I heard you talk about the need for a translation role, talk about trust. I think also we need accountability, right? So when we're taking inputs from different stakeholders in these processes, there needs to be accountability for how those inputs are used and incorporated. I think we need to address power imbalances. All stakeholders are not coming to the table on equal footing, civil society versus companies versus governments, et cetera. And then we need to have a really robust, clear process for participation. And actually, the Sao Paulo principles for multi-stakeholderism articulate a set of principles that can be used to facilitate engagement in the multi-stakeholder process. And I think civil society has really been encouraging the use and the application of the Sao Paulo principles across different, across the WSIS, within the IGF, within the GDC as a standard to help facilitate multi-stakeholderism. And I think on the question about WSIS plus 20 and its ability to bring together different knowledge, I think, WSIS is a unique process in that it was created with a people-centered vision towards using digital to achieve development and the SDGs, and it has an international framework around WSIS action lines that is then implemented at the national level, at the regional and the national level, and it also establishes the IGF. And I think something that's unique about the IGF is just the structure. So we have this annual large international event, but we also have intersessionals, we've got judicial tracks, parliamentary tracks, then we've got regional IGFs, then we've got national level IGFs. And all of those actually create a very robust framework for taking in different stakeholder inputs, creating spaces to build and bridge those silos, and then bringing it up from a national community level up into the international level. Now, how effective that has been, sure, it can be a question, but I think just the existence of that structure is really important, and I haven't seen something like that actually being proposed or put in place by other forums, processes that have been established. And so I think as we're in WSIS plus 20 and the renewal of the mandate of the IGF is up for question, civil society has been advocating for a permanent mandate for the IGF and for funding, adequate funding for the IGF to continue, and for support for the national and the regional IGFs to really make it a holistic and effective ecosystem that it can be very much a central process and forum to bring together different policy priorities, different stakeholders, et cetera.
Super, thank you. And Veronica, we are now talking about issues, topics, communities, but any international cooperation, of course, in order to be a real international cooperation, must be inclusive of all parts of the world in equal matters. Yes, I've been working a lot from Argentina. And APC is an organization that's been very much advocating for human rights from a global South, global majority perspective. So what's missing, or maybe it's nothing missing? The question is do you see still something missing to be sure that this community is integrated in these negotiations? If it's not the case, it's an issue of, of course, resources, take resources aside, it's a matter of capacities, or the platforms that are available out there are not designed in the way to be inclusive enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea, for the question. I would say a bit of all of that. But yeah, APC, when engaging in these spaces, so we advocate for certain substantive issues and certain approaches, but in general also it's about how processes are built, right? So we advocate for inclusion and participation in this international cooperation and governance spaces, because basically this lack of inclusiveness and representation in international cooperations, what we argue is can lead to norms, development and implementation that can actually reflect and even exacerbate inequalities, right? So for example, we follow this cybersecurity process at the UN, And in the case of cyber norms, what we say is basically the lack of inclusion of diverse stakeholders, but even groups from the Global South, civil society organizations representing vulnerable groups, can actually result in cyber norms that don't provide the necessary protections for these groups, and it can even exacerbate marginalization and can lead to, for example, criminalization of speech, of activists, of human rights organizations. We have seen this in the discussions connected with the Cybercrime Convention, but we also see a lot of national laws that tend to do this, exacerbate this discrimination and even silence speech of activists and human rights organizations. And when engaging in the spaces, for example, in the cyber-related processes, a lot of the engagement of civil society is about making the case of why civil society is important and why broadly non-state actors are important. So civil society in terms of cyber norms brings human rights and gender perspectives, but also what we see in these spaces is that if we get some language on those issues, for example, connected with gender, that gender is being more and more discussed in cybersecurity-related discussions, and this is one of our priorities. But if we have some references to that, that tend to be more connected with the participation of women, and if it's, or some mentions to gender. But it's difficult that this process actually addresses the complexities and the different experiences of, for example, women from rural areas, from the Global South, and from other groups. And so pushing for intersectionality is even more what we do, but we know this challenge is to have this kind of language in these spaces. So it's important that civil society is part of this conversation to bring these lived experiences of the groups in general we work with at the national and regional levels and we represent. So participation and inclusiveness is really important. It's one of our priorities when we engage in governance processes. As you were saying, there are like many challenges. So challenges at the level of the processes themselves, of the processes connected with how accreditation works, how difficult it is to get the accreditation, how the process is to veto participation of non-state actors. It's also how difficult it is to navigate those spaces, to find information, to have timely information, to have reasonable deadlines to input. Also to have, Madeline was saying this, so feedback on your inputs is like, civil society, for example, provide inputs, and it's difficult maybe to see how that is actually reflected on the texts. And sometimes we only have the opportunity to make a 2-minute statement in a session, if we have the chance. So it's good, for example, in the cyber-related processes that we have states championing for participation of stakeholders, and in particular civil society. But these processes themselves have several challenges for participation. Then there is the issue of course, capacity of civil society. I'm talking about civil society because I work with civil society. We said it in the previous round of interventions. In this context, the issue of funding, of course, is a challenge in terms of the operation of the organizations themselves, the capacity to sustain the engagement in these spaces, the capacity to build technical capacity to actually provide meaningful inputs. But then we have the travel costs to attend these spaces. And now we are having also safety concerns about attending certain processes in certain parts of the world. We are revising which are the processes we can continue actually follow because of safety issues. So yeah, there are many challenges in terms of participation from the processes themselves, but also the context civil society is now operating, right? So yeah, I'll stop here.
Super, fantastic, thank you. So we do have now a few minutes of Q&A. Anybody in the room would like to have a say? It's a big group, it's just the room is too big, but any questions, comments, reactions, frustrations?
We can share that.
Yeah, please. Yeah, there's the microphone. I would, matter of time, just a very, very short question and short answers, please. It's just because they're going to turn off the microphone right away at 10 o'clock. Sharp. Hi. Does it
No.
work? No. You want to?
Good morning. Thank you for this time. just wondering, is there a reflection about what happens in the macro perspective, but as well in the micro perspective? I've been assisting a project in between two countries here in the Nordics, and about interoperability and the different silos that is in a municipality. And the most of the people that I've been interviewing, just with the word interoperability, everyone directs address to their colleagues in the technical space. And one of the main challenges has been the organizational interoperability layer according to the European Interoperability Framework. So I can see what is the difference. You are talking with one group of stakeholders and they refer, now this is too technical for me, but it's really the problem in the organizations. I'm wondering about your comment, Madeleine, about what the universities can do during the perspective meanwhile, so have a more holistic perspective. I have seen like different kinds of programs that you can have, some electives, but as well, here in this space, different programs that are for technicians trying to understand more the geopolitical situation and diplomacy, but as well some other workshops for the other groups. Any other way to tackle this challenge, to meet together?
Yes,
in this sense.
Thank you for that. And apologies for looking back there. I just needed to read because the audio is not good up here. Yes, I mean, look, universities, particularly in the UK, where I work now, I mean, these are 1,000 years old, and they have developed in a very particular way, which is in these very narrow disciplines. That has very little bearing on the problems that we're trying to solve now. And of course, we always need specialists. We rely on those people, but much more, there's a very widespread understanding that much more we need people who have a breadth of knowledge and at least an understanding of how other disciplines work. When the students come to our universities, they understand that, they know that, but the universities have not adapted. And this comes down to the most ludicrous things like funding models between departments. If I have a student from your department on my class, where does the money go? I mean, these are literally the conversations that happen at universities. I think universities have lost contact with their mission, and that's why we have these problems. So this is just a very slow process of introducing to these quite ossified institutions that you are not facilitating the education that people want and need anymore. And that is going to have to change. But I mean, I'm doing my part. I work in a department of computer science and I'm an international relations academic, but it is a real problem, a real problem.
So you managed to bridge the silos as an IR scholar in a computer science department.
Yeah, and I would say that my computer science colleagues are very receptive because they're also interested in geopolitics, or not all of them, but some of them are interested in that and they enjoy working together with people from other disciplines.
Super. I think we are unfortunately running out of time. Just 30 seconds conclusive remarks, any of you, if you would like to add anything, or no? Yeah.
I mean, I would just say, like, I think when we're thinking about bridging silos in digital cooperation, it's important to recognize the importance of bodies like the Freedom Online Coalition, like GNI, like networks like APC, in facilitating a lot of the knowledge sharing and the capacity building that needs to happen, so the different stakeholders can talk to each other, they can have a dialogue with each other, they might not all be on the same position, but there's perspective sharing, so then they show up in these spaces with a little bit more understanding, maybe coordination where it makes sense. So while you've got these core processes happening at the international level, there's a whole kind of ring of networks and bodies doing a lot of important knowledge sharing and capacity building.
Just very quickly to what Elle and I said, and given that we are here at the IGF, the national and regional IGFs are also places where a lot of work and collaboration and bridging silos can happen in a really effective way, because they also address the localities, right, and the local problems that are so core to the conversations that we're doing, and they have become perhaps the main thing the main challenge in many ways of how even governments respond at the international level. So we need to lean into the expertise that exists, and this expertise, again, is multidisciplinary at the national and local level and regional level, to be able and elevate then into the global level to address some of those issues and bridge those silos.
I fully agree, but it's true. LNI has organized a very great session at the IGF Africa 3 weeks ago, and it's true that I feel that there's another kind of risk of growing silos, because regional IGF totally detached from what's going on here in the global IGF, and that is another silos actually that is worth to invest some energy, as you will say. So at the moment, and being in regional IGF for years, I've been back now, and with the idea that maybe things have changed over so many years, but actually the impression is that that's not the case, unfortunately. So anyway, the session time is up, unfortunately. I'm not sure whether we have managed to bridge any silos today, unfortunately, but I think already the fact that we are not giving things for granted, and we have sessions like this one that help us to reflect on the fact that there are silos out there. There is a ITU, there's a process happening in a couple of weeks, but there is also a UN process happening in New York at the same time. To acknowledge that I don't understand why these things happen at the same time, I think is already kind of an important take-home point. And so to be continued, I will organize another session on that at the next IGF, if there will be another IGF. Thank you so much for joining us today.